is not acceptable under any given circumstances and so on. And you mentioned that in the second one, namely the basic needs point of view. But the basic needs point of view is absolutely transcendent with regard to the to my mind, to a strong extent transcendent to the point of view of a contextualist situation. Take what I would like to describe from an Aristotelian point of view, the concept of intrinsic values. Intrinsic values. I think there are not so many variations on that, given from a point of view of human nature. I provocatively use the term of human nature. And let me finally use a term which is lacking throughout your paper. Astonishingly for me, that's the concept of perfectionism. Perfectionism is so widely discussed in contemporary moral philosophy and political philosophy that I'm surprised that you do not even take it into account. Thank you.
So I will do two very short questions. First,
okay.
Sorry.
Maybe I should start answering.
That's okay. We take three.
Okay.
Okay. Answer.
Let me say, I can take three actually. Okay, let me start with the Hegel versus Aristotle question. This is, I wouldn't say that this is a contextual theory. It goes beyond contextualism because it even more. It might seem even weirder to you, or it is in a way even a weirder position, because it somehow takes seriously the idea of a rationality in history. So it's not contextualism, but it's contextualism historicized. Meaning that even if we start, even if we take the contextual story series, there is a reason why these concepts have evolved, and we could kind of trace back this kind of development and make sense of it by way of judging whether it's in a way I would say that my main dichotomy is regressive or non-regressive forms of life. So in a way it ends up with the notion of regression in a certain way. So talking about hindrances blocked learning processes and so on, I would say the Deweyan picture of these learning processes and of a certain typology of what can hinder us to go forward is not rich enough, whereas the Hegelian picture is a bit richer. But then you have something that is certainly not particularistic, certainly not certainly a way of dealing with contexts that doesn't take them just as a given. So it's not that you would take a certain historical or social situation as a given that goes without saying, but it means asking for reasons or asking behind the kind of development that has led to a certain context and trying to justify these contexts as context. So that I would say that it's more, it's not a contextualist communitarian view, but Hegelian, and this means there is some kind of rationality and history of philosophy of history involved, which, as I would easily accept, is a huge burden to make sense of that. But then there was one misunderstanding involved. You said, I do accept I do accept external standards, for example, the moral point of view and the basic need. No, I don't. When I began with this was just in order to somehow draw draw a rough sketch of what in a certain kind of discussion seems to be at stake. So we have morally legitimate standards, we have something like taste that we can't argue about. I would actually not buy into the whole distinction that, I mean, I wouldn't say that this distinction makes so much sense at all, and I wouldn't be so sure that that the external moral point of view can be legitimated as easily as some people would go for, as Habermas always says, the narrow point of view of justice and morality that we have to hold on, because everything else is a bit like fuzzy terrain in order to hold on to certain universalistic demands that we want to hold on. We have to somehow narrow the scope. So this is basically, I mean, at least one of the more pragmatic aspects of it, and I wouldn't be happy with this picture. So, and also the basic needs thing, I introduced it in order to have it was more about having a contrast. Why don't I start with needs? It would be an obvious candidate to say, okay, we could judge forms of life by way of examining whether they fulfill human needs. But then you have the problem, and everyone knows it. I mean, it's not that people who talk on needs, about needs wouldn't be aware of this, these aspects. So then you, then all these attempts to differentiate and to build into the very concept of needs something that can account for these differences and the malleability of needs and the very fact that it's just not the case that human beings over history and over, I mean, that it would be so easy to come down to a certain set of needs. If you don't then want to refer to needs that are not distinctively human, I mean, of course, there's something that can be contested, but then most of these things are something that are characteristics that are common to all, not to all human beings, but to human beings and animals, for something. I mean, need for shelter, need for food, and so on is not something that might not be distributable, and that is not very meaningful. I just wanted to say that I'm not against needs accounts, and I'm not. It's not that I wouldn't think that the theorizing about needs is something that we should just get away from. It's only that I would think that the concept of problems somehow starts from the other end of the spectrum, and that it might be an interesting thing that it does so, and that it just starts there where we already have this level of interpretation and the level of differences and the level of whatever. We might come down, I'm not really sure, we might be, because you said it's the alternatives are limited. I don't think, I mean, actually I think the variants and the I mean, there's a huge range of options. But still, we might come down to certain instances or certain problems. I mean, even starting from the problem account, we might come down to an analysis that would say, okay, so there seem to be certain, let's at least say, clusters of problems that are common to mankind. I mean, wherever human beings have been living, there is somehow the problem of reproduction, of course. And you could, I mean, but again, this would be to start the argument from the other end of the spectrum. Yeah, so maybe there are some universal human needs, and we could find out about them by way of spelling out on a more abstract level what is involved in certain kinds of historically shaped and situated problems. But then again, I would say, I mean, it's just a matter of where to start from, and I'm not so sure that we might. And I mean, I have different. I mean, if I would talk about needs, I would suggest a different approach to needs anyway. Something that goes more in the direction of the way one refers to one's desires than towards the direction, or towards the idea that we can have a sharp distinction between what we desire and what we need in a certain way. But this is a different discussion. Individualization and dual concept. So you're totally right that this is, I'm avoiding a dual concept, and that what I see as the advantage of this practice account of forms of life has also something to do with the, at least the possibility of having somehow a monistic, I mean, not in the, don't misunderstand me, but there's some monism involved, that I would say, again, taking practices as the basic unit, then developing out of that the idea that practice also, I mean, practices have this kind of subjective and objective dimension, or the kind of idea that they are structuring, I mean, it's a bit similar to what Gibbon does in social theory, that there is structure and action and a certain kind of that to a certain degree it doesn't make sense to us what has been, I mean, whether the egg or the hen has been first. So this means that this practice approach is well suited to take into account the kind of phenomena that, for example, Habermas thought that he could only deal with if he includes and introduces the notion of a system. For example, the very fact that there's in social life not everything is can be traced back to a certain kind of intention, to a certain kind of intended action that we have. And the market is always the best example that we have all sorts of non-intended consequences that then interact with other and so on and so on. And I would think that, I don't know, developing, I haven't done this, but even if it comes, for example, to the question of whether the market is, I mean, has to be seen as part of the life world or part of the system, I would say that it would be a good thing to have an account of an institutional, practice-oriented account of the market that wouldn't lead you into the situation that you can't refer to this phenomena of unintended consequences, invisible hand phenomena that, of course, have been adequately, in a way, adequately described. This is something that's not, one shouldn't put into question these effects, but the question is whether, what kind of basic concepts are adequate and good in order to deal with that. And I mean, coming back to the question of the critique of capitalism, I would say it's somehow a necessary precondition in order not to end up with the idea of, I don't know, how could the life role somehow tame the market, and why can't, or tame capitalism, and why can't it, and so on. I mean, in order to somehow get back into the realm of the economy, it might be useful to get rid of the dual conception. I mean, this is nothing new. Habermas has been criticized for this a lot, and a lot of people know that the very fact that critical theory has somehow lost touch, not in a political way, but in a philosophical way, with the topic of criticizing capitalism has something to do. I mean, at the very bottom of the conceptual decisions might have be something to do with this dual conception. So, yeah, this is where then individualization and socialization. Again, I would think that if you give an account of what practices mean, and if you give an account of the so-called constitutive side of practices that enable, that first enable you to do something, then you have a somehow different approach. I mean, this is not really different from Habermas, because the idea of individualization through socialization is just being spelled out in a different way. If you refer to these constitutive practices and refer to them as something that that is not, or that is always at the same kind, limits to our possibility of acting as individuals and precondition for doing it. And then you have, I mean, the question of how individuals fit into these social roles and practices, and how the dynamics of the change comes about, comes down to, I mean, what Goffman would call the these cracks that somehow open up, and also I mean, this is something that it's interesting. It's shared from Judith Butler to Goffman to a lot of people who would say the very fact that one has to repeat practices. I mean, the practices are not something that can be repeated in a similar way all the time. They have to be reenacted, they have to be reappropriated, and even a social role or a social practice that is somehow too narrowly described wouldn't even enable. I mean, it's not only that it would set too strong a limit to individuals in order to realize themselves or whatever, it's also that as a set of practices and roles it doesn't really work, because this kind of adjustment doesn't really work. So I wouldn't think that it's something that would necessarily lead you into a situation, I mean, where you couldn't take into account the kind of tensions that come up in between individuals and forms of life and social practices. And too long.
So, second round, very concise. My two short questions. Who criticize forms of life? The very individuals who participate in them, or individuals who do not participate in them but are members of the society, or an external observer, or groups? Second question, when I criticize form of life for not being successful in solving problems, am I not doing a functional criticism with no moral and ethical dimension? Second question, Marcelo.
This was one question?
Yeah.
Well, there are two questions. No, I mean second.
Okay. Thank you for the lecture. And in the attempt to criticize a form of life, what exactly do we appeal to? Do we appeal to reasons? Do we appeal to the internal coherence of a form of life? My question is whether you think that in the attempt to criticize a form of life, would it be a legitimate move to appeal to works of art? It seems to me that very often we express our disapproval of a form of life not by means of a conversation with other people. We simply try to express our point of view by means of films, of plays, of expositions in museums and novels, and even by means of songs, are quite effective, and I would say in our culture far more effective than trying to engage with other people in a conversation. The paradox here might be perhaps that it only works in the context of a society which already has become, in a sense, sensitive to this to works of art as a form of expression, a point of view, and that might be, at the end of the day, just another form of life. So, how do you see it? Thank you.
Here, the first one.
The gentleman in the front.
In fact, my question is a very short one. In the introduction, you said that after your lecture, the Rawlsian approach to the problem wouldn't seem so attractive as it seems at first. Well, but while you exposed it, I saw that your concept of forms of life seems to be very different from the Rawlsian concept of conceptions of the good and comprehensive doctrines that would be the nearest Rawlsian conceptions of yours. And my
seem to be different.
seems to be very different. And my question is, to what extent do you think they can be conflated? And if you agree with me that they are very different, to what extent do you think you can criticize the Rawlsian approach using concepts that are totally external to it? That's it.
Okay.
We make this.
So this one and then another
This
two.
one and then
Okay.
Another three questions.
Okay.
So, look at that.
I start with the last question. Yes, of course, it's totally different, and this is one of my claims. I mean, I'm not engaging with Rawls that much because I'm not. I mean, it's not that I'm in. As I said, it's more about motivating a different approach than about engaging in a debate that has been going on for quite some while. Of course, it's totally different, but I mean, my claim, if I would have to make it a bit more. I don't know. I don't want it to be as confrontative or hostile, but I would say in Rawls there's just a lack of social theory, a lack of sociology, a lack of and this was the reason. And then I mean, one reason why I would take serious the forms of life. I mean, this is not something that Rawls uses, but Habermas uses it a lot. That was. I mean, I was somehow. I mean, if I should talk about why I think that Rawls is wrong, I would say there are some of it is. I mean, I wouldn't say that the whole theory is wrong. Don't understand me wrongly, but some of it is based on a certain kind of diagnosis of time, like the fact of pluralism. And is based on a certain kind of idea of how society, how social formations work, like comprehensive doctrines. And then once you have a closer look and ask yourself, what is this comprehensive doctrine thing about? What is this pluralism about? Then of course he's a philosopher, he's not a sociologist, but he might be informed by the wrong kind of sociology or the wrong sociological assumptions about how, for example, self-contained forms of life, how comprehensive doctrines. I mean, and I would, again, I'm not so interested in I mean, it's just a starting point for me. I'm not interested in, I mean, why would one, and you're totally right, why would one criticize someone on the grounds of things that he is just not interested in? Because he's not doing social philosophy, he's doing normative political philosophy. In the end, I would say there are some limits to normative political philosophy. And there are some limits that have something to do with the absence of a social theory and the absence of the absence of giving a serious account of what the inner structure of society and the social institutions that then a certain kind of normative political philosophy wants to judge upon, right? So, I mean, I would have to say a bit more of it, and I could even make it much more critical, but in this case, it's just an observation that obviously in order to get out of the confrontation that, out of the confrontation between people who would say a priority of the right, and then people who would say, yeah, but every attempt to establish or to justify the position of the right is somehow based on a conception of the good. So I mean, you can be tracing this back. I mean, this has been going on for decades now, that everyone would say, okay, this is more basic, that is more basic, this can be justified in a better way. I'm not making fun of it. I mean, it's not that I don't take these discussions serious. It's just that at this point I thought you can't get out of this of these arguments going back and forth without investigating in some of the basic things going on within, with the very basic texture of it. The same would hold for the relativism debate, which goes back and forth in a certain way. I would say in the attempt that the way one should go is again to have a look at these this basic texture. So I'm very lucky that the first two questions are somehow linked together in a way that makes it easy for me to answer. Alessandro's question, who does criticize forms of life? I mean, my idea, of course, is that it should be an immanent position. An immanent position is not the same thing as Michael Waltz's local critic, for example. So it's not that I would refer to internal critique that somehow trusts that there are norms and values already established in a certain kind of community and society, and we should somehow bring the society to its own, to fulfill its own ideas and identity, and to get to its best. So it's more, I'm interested in establishing a strong alternative between this kind of local particularist internal critique and what I would call immanent critique. I mean, you could also, Honneth, for example, has the same kind of distinction but calls it differently. But this doesn't, doesn't make the case. I would then go for an immanent critique that is not as positive again as, for example, Honneth's reconstructive approach would be, but that is a bit more negativistic by way of trying to spell out, this is why I'm interested in contradictions and crisis, spelling out things that come up because certain norms are at the same time realized in a certain social formation and not realized, but not the way that Walzer, for example, would conceive of it. So people just have somehow pay lip service to certain kind of values, so we should convince them that they should act on it, but it's something that has more to do with a more transformative way of, again, seeing these contradictions and analyzing the reasons for why a certain set of norms is not realized in a certain society by way of spelling out why it can be, in a certain condition can be realized. But yeah, so this would be a stronger and more transformative version of immanent critique. And who criticizes? I mean, I would say, if you go for an external critique, if you go for people outside, whatever the outside of society might be, if you go for external critique, then you are confronted with paternalism and all sorts of accusations. So, yeah, the reason why I would go for this kind of immanent ideology critique, crisis-driven, whatever, of forms of life is exactly that I want to avoid this kind of paternalism. Or not only that I want to avoid, that I don't see it. I mean, sometimes this kind of external critique makes a lot of sense, but you always end up with serious problems concerning exactly who is in the position to do what. And on the other side, you can't just, it's not an internal, I wouldn't say it's, I would go for the people who are already inside, because another strong feature is the objective dimension of it, that it's not only about the relation that individuals have towards the social institutions and practices, but it's also about the inherent inability of these institutional practices to perform in a certain way. So what I would call the object, or even, it's an expression from Arnold Ruhe, who says objective critique. Of course, objective critique again is not only, it's not that social institutions, of course, they don't break down on their own. They break down because, or they erode because individuals, they're delegitimized. But I would say, after decades of only talking about so to say, the subjective side of how can we establish norms in order to criticize society, I would say that the Hegelian or even Marxist moment of spelling out the objective contradictions that are inherent in a certain situation, or the crisis moment, it makes sense. If you're aware of the fact that crisis is, again, something where if you have an interesting concept of crisis, and Habermas, for example, has a very interesting concept of crisis, we were talking about this morning, about the legitimation crisis book. If you have an interesting concept of crisis where these two aspects come together, and I would say Hegel, describing the crisis of bourgeois society, had an interesting concept of crisis already, then, yeah, I mean, in order to be provocative, who criticizes forms of life, in a way they criticize themselves. Because, I mean, it's not the way of, okay, let's just wait until the revolution will call us on our mobiles if it's there. This is not what I mean, but I would say that, again, I mean, it's always a question of balancing these discussions. It's not so, it's of some interest to analyze social formations from the perspective of what makes them inherently unstable or eroding. Which then comes to your question about the functional criticism. Yeah, it has a functional element, but it has a functional element that, again, would be, as the objective and subjective dimension of crisis, that would be, I would say, in human society and in social institutions, there is no such thing as a pure function. There's nothing that just works or doesn't work. It works, I mean, the way it works, working good, working in a way that we want it to work in a way. I mean, then again, you have a variety of possibilities how to establish functions and how to impute functions on something that, yeah, I mean, put it shortly, I would go for some kind of ethical, functional norms that then provide us with a kind of critique that has at least some functional element in it. Which is, again, I mean, if you talk about, for example, bourgeois society and the question of the unemployed, I would say this is, I mean, there are certain, there's a variety of possible reactions. One would be the moral reaction, it's just so bad that these people are starving or out of work. The other would be the purely functional, that would talk about the disintegration. I would go for, I mean, the kind of immanent critique I would go for is something that has to do with both sides, that it doesn't work in a good way. It's unstable, but it's unstable out of reasons that have something to do with the normative loneliness of these aspirations. So then again, last question, the art question. Who was it?
Marcel.
Marcel. Sorry. I would say yes, of course. I mean, there are all sorts of things that we can appeal to. There are all sorts of things that can make us see the problems of forms of life. And maybe, I mean, at least a certain kind of problems I started with are very likely to be addressed, for example, by pieces of art. This is something that, I mean, in the typology of forms of critique has always been discussed as some of the world disclosing critique. And I would say, and it's not that, I mean, there are people who would strongly reject this, but I mean, I would somehow stay with a bit, I don't know, narrow-minded framework. I would say these world-disclosing elements that you hinted at by bringing into the picture pieces of art and so on, they are somehow, I don't know, they're tools or means in order to let us see something. But I would think that in the end, the kind of immanent, I mean, yeah, I mean, I would go for a normative, even if I reject what I would call normativism, or a kind of normativity that comes from an external perspective. I would say that within this perspective of immanent critique, there is, of course, normativity involved, and also I would hold that critique needs some kind of, or always refers to some kind of normative standards. So if pieces of art makes us see, and suddenly see that a certain way of, a certain form of life is whatever, regressive, kitschy, ugly, self-contradicting. What then, I mean, the next step is then critique, or to, I mean, is then something that doesn't only lead to some kind of repulsion, but also to something that doesn't necessarily have. Maybe forms of life are transformed just because people have these disclosing moments and effects where they just see that. So, I mean, it's just so extremely narrow-minded to live in this kind of family and so. But in order to spell out, to go for a real critique and to spell it out, I would say that even these moments that you that are linked to this kind of moments that art brings about, you have to somehow be able to spell it out, to somehow develop ethical, dense or rich or thick concepts that would somehow be able to give an account for what's wrong about this form of life that you have learned to see in a certain way because pieces of art made you see it in a certain way. But I mean, in a situation where someone else has a different opinion of it, you have to, I mean, it's not enough to stay with this kind of effect that art might have had on you. So it's not that I would go for a reason all the way down, meaning that you always start with this kind of appeal to reasons, but in the end, and I mean a standard, for example, I mean something like I already mentioned regression as something that I would count as a very strong candidate for some kind of standards. I would think this is something that that can be made seen through these moments, but in the end you can also give an account of why it is bad to act in a certain way or to be somehow trapped in social institutions that one could count as regressive, even if it's very likely that in order to really see and feel the regressiveness of it, you need something else than pure arguments. But so I would say there's some kind of a division of labor of working together these instances of critique, but the world disclosing critique is not a full alternative to.
So I have still many people inscribed, but we don't have time, so we'll take the last question.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Sorry.
Just something, I identified a kind of tension in your talk, because first you refused on purpose to give criteria that could judge different forms of life, and as Professor Amy underscored. But at the same time, you use words as such regressive forms of life, non-regressive forms of life. In the very end of your talk, you said you're looking for the correct solution, right, for the problems we're facing nowadays. So I don't know. I see a tension here. Okay, on the one, okay, you don't want to establish a criteria for judging forms of life, and yet you're saying that there are regressive and non-regressive forms of life. So this is and this is one question. Like when you carry out a critique of forms of life, isn't there the risk of positing a hierarchy among them? And how can you avoid this risk? And my second question is it's the following. Does problem solving explain all our lives? Because it seems to me that you are reducing all life to problem solving. And I don't know, one could argue that one's form of life was not chosen on a rational basis. Do you know what I mean? Like, yes.
Okay, the first thing, I mean, this is misunderstanding. I am actually looking for criteria. The only thing that I refused is what you might call substantial criteria. A very rough picture, substantial criteria would be criteria who would aim at spelling out some of the contents of what a form of life should provide you with. For example, I mean, even Martha Nussbaum, who claims to have a vague and open concept, I mean, list of what it should be. There's something like, I mean, she would say there's, I'm too tired. But I mean, in the capability approach, you have things like human beings have a sense of humor, they have this and that. So there are all sorts of things that a good society should provide individuals with in order to to at least give them the possibility to act on these capacities, and what would account for a much stronger, more substantial idea of what a good society or a good form of life should consist in. And this is the thing I didn't go for. I would say, of course, regression, non-regression, they are strongly, I mean, this is a good example of a concept that is, in a way, a really thick concept, because you just have to accuse someone of being regressive, and you don't have to spell out that there's something wrong about it, it's something that, but at the same time, it's a very complicated and I think informative criterion. And what I mean, or what I'm referring to as regressive or non-regressive, is something that can be spelled out in the, as Emil accused me, formalistic way. And this is what I'm going for. I'm going for this formal criterion in order to assess forms of life. And with formal, I don't mean, at a certain point I said procedural, which might be misleading. I mean that you are not talking about what kind of aspects a form of life should have in order to be a good one, but how they have evolved, what the kind of relationship. I mean, it's about the kind of dynamics that have led to a certain result. It's not about the result. It's not about judging what kind of results we need, what kind of results would be good or bad. It's about, and the idea is that, this is why I'm talking about learning processes, that there might be processes that are somehow obstructed or have deficits as dynamics of change or of transformation. Not because of the result, but because you could see, I mean, a very dangerous example is, I mean, it's very easy to say that fascism is a bad thing and an immoral thing and whatever. If you look at the kind of analysis that, for example, Adorno Horkheimer gave to the development that led into fascism, then you could see that, I mean, of course, I mean, the moral reaction to it goes without saying, but you could see that the way they analyze what has led to the situation that's going on there is strongly related to the idea of regression, and I would even say the idea of that there have been some problems evolving in whatever modern capitalist society that have become where fascism was the wrong solution to, in a solution that wasn't on the height of where the problem occurred and so on. I mean, this is really a dangerous example because you have a lot of, I mean, of course, it's contested what really has been going on wherever, but just as an example, you can judge on certain outcomes of a historical development on the basis of the result, or also on the basis of how it has, I mean, how we got on the second floor, as Alessandro said this morning. This is what I would go for. And then the hierarchy and avoiding the risk. I mean, I have to confess, I won't. Of course, this is the idea. If you're not aiming at in the end, I mean, even if you have, even if you hold that there might be a variety of forms of life and a variety of solutions to certain problems that are like in the same range of adequacy. But of course, I mean, the whole idea is to have, a hierarchy between forms of life that fail and forms of life that don't. Of course. I mean, this is why it's so important to be not paternalistic, to go for the crisis moment, to be, the whole story, the whole set of Vorsichtsmaßnahmen, my English is out at this point of the day, has something to do with the risk that you name. But of course, in the end, it's taking this risk. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. I apologize to the 6 people who were inscribed. Well, 2 of them have already left. I'm sorry. We have no time. It's almost 10 o'clock, and Rahel must be very tired. We thank her very much.
Yeah, thank you so much.
And, we will meet again tomorrow morning at 8 for the communications, and tomorrow afternoon at 2 here for the papers, and then at 6:30 for the lecture of Christopher.
7:30.
Sorry, 7:30.
7:30, yeah.
Thank you. Good night to you.